As a software developer, a couple regular questions I receive are along the lines of, how do I get into computer science? What are some tips you have for software developers? What do I do to get into a career in software development? I don't know. Let's talk about Hatsune Miku. Music, like most things that bring us joy in our feeble lives, can be reduced to the physical phenomenon of little wobbly things. In more technical terms, sound is a wave of compressed air that has a frequency and an amplitude. The amplitude is just how much the particles can compress, with a higher amplitude corresponding to more energy in the wave, meaning a louder sound. On the other hand, frequency is how many times the particles can compress and decompress per second, with a higher frequency corresponding to a higher pitch. Sound waves follow the superposition principle, meaning that to add them together, you can add them together. When playing two sounds at the same time, their amplitudes add up at every point. But that was just the basis of sound physics. It doesn't really encompass what music is. However, if you throw away the parts where you have to understand math and then throw in some abstract Italian words, you bring yourself to music theory. In music theory, several special frequencies of sounds are labeled as notes. A sound of a frequency of 261.63 Hz, or waves per second, is widely adopted to be considered as middle C. By categorizing frequencies of sound into different notes, it allows for an easy-to-read way to express music to musicians. But are these notes just assigned at random? But the intervals between the notes are not assigned at random. In fact, the appreciation of music is mostly just the appreciation of nice-looking fractions. Wow, it's my favorite song. If the frequency of one note is twice the frequency of another note, then that interval is called an octave. If the frequency of one note is 3/2 the frequency of another note, then that interval is a perfect fifth. If the ratio of frequencies looks like this sequence, then it is the first few intervals of Gangnam Style. Of course, you can play two notes of an interval at the same time in a chord to add sound waves together. On a piano, this is fairly simple to do. Just press two different keys and then two strings of different lengths are struck, propagating waves of different frequencies. A pipe organ is similar to a piano, except for the fact that none of the parts are the same. Instead of vibrating different length strings, it directs air through different length pipes. These pipes can be as long as 64 feet, though by feet I mean the slightly different unit of measurement, sonic feet. I can't find any citation for this anywhere though. I wonder why. Compressed air is directed through the pipe. The higher volume of air, the more energy being carried, thus producing a wave with a higher amplitude or a louder sound. Similar to a longer string on a piano, a longer pipe on a pipe organ produces a sound of a lower frequency, which is lower pitched. But what really sets the pipe organ apart is the fact that there isn't just one row for the scale of pitches. Rather, there are multiple rows called ranks of different types of pipes which can be selected from. Types of pipes with different constructions produce unique sounds, and they all have their own names, many of them named after existing instruments. The tuba, for example, is named after the trumpet, and the vox humana is named after the human. A major difference between types of pipes is whether the sound is produced solely by the vibration of air, like a flute, or with the vibration of a reed, like a clarinet. But other differences include the material that the pipe is made out of, the size of the components, the overall shape of the pipe, etc. But regardless, pipe organs being pipe organs make pipe sounds. But what happens when you change the shape of the pipe drastically? If you have been on this channel before, one thing you should note about what I said on notes and frequencies is that once again I have lied. You should have expected it this time though. Pianos produce a perfect sine wave or pure tone of exactly the frequency of the note if the pianos are terrible, because then all the keys would just sound like... In truth, piano strings produce a sound wave that is a lot more chaotic than just a simple sine function. We can notice, however, that even in the more complicated piano sound wave, there is still a resemblance of a frequency and an amplitude. Different instruments can use different methods, materials, sizes, and shapes to manipulate this chaos differently, thus producing different sounds. Musicians themselves can also use different techniques on the same instruments to manipulate this chaos further. This chaos, which differentiates between sound waves of the same frequency and amplitude, is called the timbre, or the tone color, which is why a pipe organ has so many rows for the same frequency and amplitude settings. In fact, theoretically, if you change the timbre enough, you could achieve any sound of the same frequency and amplitude. In 1779, Christian Kratzenstein theorized that he could design 5 pipes of an organ in such a way that they mimic 5 vowels common in European language. And he did, creatively naming it the vowel organ. The A, E, O, and U pipes used reeds. The I pipe simply just vibrated the air like a flute. The pipes themselves were in the shape of misshapen pipes, and as the vibrations traveled through them, they were manipulated into relatively clear pronunciations of the vowels. In a natural pipe organ, otherwise known as a human, air is pumped by the lungs and directed through the vocal folds, which then vibrate, producing sounds that can be filtered and articulated by the parts of the vocal tract above these folds. These parts of the vocal tract, called articulators, include things like the tongue, the cheeks, and the lips, and in combination with the muscles around the vocal folds are capable of producing many different timbres and pitches. 不同语言口音也会偏用声道内不同的部分，这就是语音学的基础。This is because the vocal tract is very dynamic, and its ability to constantly change while sound is being produced allows for very complex sounds, such as sentences. In an artificial natural pipe organ, otherwise known as a pipe organ, this advantage does not exist, as the pipes maintain the same shape throughout the duration of the organ being played. Remember when I said that I lied? I actually lied again. I lied about lying. Never expect anything. In truth, sound waves are composed of pure tones, but just many of them. If you get enough pure tones, or sine and cosine waves of different frequencies and amplitudes, you can sum them all up and get any sound wave you want. This sum is a representation of a function called the Fourier series. The part that differentiates between different functions are the amplitudes on these sine and cosine waves. The lowest frequency in this sum is called the fundamental frequency, which is what defines the pitch. You can think of adding sine and cosine waves of larger and larger frequencies to be creating more and more precise estimations of the function. With an infinite number of waves, this would become infinitely precise, but since that's impossible and humans can only hear a certain range of frequencies anyway, for sound waves we can simply just limit this to a number of waves less than infinity at the cost of having no music production software for elephants. If you create a Fourier series with waves of increasing frequencies where the amplitudes are respectively -2/1, -2/2, -2/3, etc., then you get a sawtooth wave which sounds like. If instead you made the amplitudes 4/pi, 0, 4/3pi, 0, 4/5pi, 0, etc., you get a square wave which sounds like. Note that both of these sounds are fairly simple to produce, and you may be familiar with them if you've ever heard 8-bit or chiptune music. Early game consoles would synthesize these sounds on the spot rather than playing back recorded audio, which would take up too much memory. Now, the sound chips on old game consoles were made to be affordable, but what if you needed a sound chip meant for something that prioritized sound quality? Almost like a Game Boy, but more advanced. Like the Yamaha DX series synthesizer keyboard. With a more advanced sound chip, you can play more advanced sounds, such as those simulating sounds of traditional instruments. For example, when a note is played on a traditional instrument, it typically starts off with a louder sound or an attack that slowly decays into a quieter sound that is sustained until it is released. These 4 parameters, attack, decay, sustain, and release, are seen in the Mozart vs. Skrillex rap battle, but also on synthesizers, as knobs or sliders that can adjust how the amplitude changes throughout time. Together, these 4 parameters form the envelope of the note, which envelopes the note. With the use of computers, we're able to play a sound that can be represented by the Fourier series and then modify the amplitudes of that series as it plays. You may have noticed that by now, all the problems of the vowel organ have been resolved. Better luck next time, Kratzenstein. Still, a human voice is far more convoluted than a cat piano, but it can be analyzed. One way to analyze human voice is with the Fourier transform. Now, the mathematics behind this are a bit beyond the scope of this video, and I'm no mathematician, so I won't waste your time. Oh wait, this is YouTube. A Fourier transform, grossly simplified, scans over a graph in time and amplitude such as that of a sound wave, and then determines how much each frequency contributes to each point in time on that graph. The resulting Fourier transform is a graph of frequencies. Now what this graph is a frequency domain representation of the sound wave, which is complex, and by complex I mean contains complex numbers, and it also happens to be difficult to understand. But this being a gross simplification, you can consider the graph to be a function in which you can put in a frequency and get back how the pure tone of that frequency contributes to the original sound wave. Use this information to reconstruct the Fourier series and you get back the original sound wave. This process is inverse to the Fourier transform and is called the inverse Fourier transform. If we change properties of the individual pitches and then convert it back to a sound wave with the inverse Fourier transform, we've ultimately manipulated the audio. In essence, the key here is that the Fourier transform allows us to not change the sound wave as a whole, but rather the fundamental components of the sound wave, giving us much more freedom to change specific qualities of a sound than, say, with a set of acoustic pipes. This paved the way for many audio engineering tools, thus allowing us to have things like Auto-Tune and Alvin and the Chipmunks Road Chip. Thanks, Fourier. The Fourier transform can be obtained with algorithms such as fast Fourier transform, which gets the Fourier transform fastly. But perhaps the component of higher interest is what we are doing between the Fourier transform and the inverse Fourier transform to actually change the sound. Since we can modify sound at a fairly free degree, whether with the Fourier transform or not, and human voice is produced by articulators modifying the sound produced by our lungs and vocal cords, one idea we can do is to take inspiration directly from the mechanisms of actual human voice. This forms the basis of the source filter model, which generates some sound of a certain pitch and then passes it through a vocal tract. Of course, this vocal tract isn't an actual vocal tract, just like how artificial intelligence isn't intelligence and the universe isn't a simulation. Rather, it's a set of filters that can be applied to the frequencies of the source sound determined by analyzing the patterns or production of actual human voice. Before the source filter model, there was the voder, which didn't use a computer because it was 1939, but it did have two source sounds, either a buzzing tone, which resembled the vibrations of the vocal cords, or a hissing sound, which resembled the sound of air being pushed out of the lungs. These sounds were then passed through a bank of 10 electric filtering devices, which controlled not only what was being pronounced, but also the tone it was being pronounced in, allowing for tones such as monotone and sassy. The company that developed the voder, Bell Labs, later went on to make the famous recording of Daisy Bell on the IBM 7094 in 1961. Which was later on referenced in Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, as well as numerous creepypasta animatics, perhaps because at this stage of development the vocal synthesis is still rather eerie, although I have yet to see any animatics of a Kratzenstein-era vowel organ. The IBM 7094 is often referred to as the grandfather of Miku, and the source filter model is perhaps the truest form of voice synthesis that exists on a computer. Since it talks and sings with the most fundamental sounds of human voice, you could theoretically, given enough data, make a model that talks and sings in any language. In fact, since the earliest techniques of analyzing human speech for vocal synthesis, or the vocoder, also happened to be good at reducing bandwidth for vocal transmissions, research in this field was very much an international security effort, and with the culminative decades of research and development, a model was engineered that was so powerful and so sophisticated that nobody used it. The source filter model is scientifically impressive. It's also flexible with the sounds it can create, resulting in a relatively smooth voice synthesization. But with the rise of personal computers came the rise of personal computer users, and just because a model is scientifically impressive doesn't mean it's appealing to the average music producer. For one, the sound quality depends heavily on both the synthesis from the initial sound as well as the analysis of data to help create this synthesis, resulting in a voice that can be a bit more muffled, sounding less like Miku and more like Miku with influenza. Additionally, we may want to synthesize a specific voice or even a specific person's voice, which is often the case in applications of voice synthesis. And while it is possible with the source filter model, it's just not intuitive to derive the frequency domains of Bernie Sanders vocal tract configurations. And so we arrive at the question, if a Cold War isn't going to give us commercial vocal synthesis, What will? In 2007, Crypton Future Media, on top of Yamaha software, released Hatsune Miku. Hatsu being Japanese for first, ne meaning sound, and Miku meaning future. But Hatsune Miku is neither the first Vocaloid, nor the first Japanese Vocaloid, nor the best Vocaloid. Vocaloids are personified by a diverse cast of charismatic anime-style virtual idols who just happen to be highly marketable. Most are familiar with the characters distributed by Crypton, notably Meiko, Kaito, Miku, Rin Len, and Luca. But Vocaloid characters can be developed and distributed by any independent studio in any language given a license from Yamaha. Utau is Japanese for sing, but it's also Japanese for English for Japanese for the Utau singing synthesizer. Vocaloid is not actually the name of the process of singing synthesis, but rather the name of the specific software produced by Yamaha, the most recent of which being Vocaloid 5. Vocaloid. About 2 years after the release of Hatsune Miku and Vocaloid 2, an anonymous developer, under the name of Ameya, decided to release a synthesizer application with even worse documentation. This, of course, was Utau. The biggest difference between Vocaloid and Utau is that Utau does not require a license for creating new characters, called Utauloids, resulting in Vocaloids being voiced by professional voice actors and singers, while Utauloids can be voiced by anyone. Regardless of who is voicing the characters are all voiced by real people, which indicates to us that perhaps the models used are different from those of source filter models. Indeed, the model used by Vocaloid, Utau, and any other singing synthesizer in this class are a complete different model from the ones used more commonly in the past. That's right, Miku is an orphan. Metaphorically. Vocaloid was developed by a joint research team at Pompeu Fabra University, Barcelona, backed by Yamaha and led by Kenmochi Hideki from the years 2000 to 2004. For the first year, the team did work on a source filter model that they coined as the Excitation plus Resonance model, and a paper was published in 2001. However, the model was deemed to be unnatural, especially among the consonants, and so the team said, you know what, we'll just make a automatic YouTube poop maker, and so concatenative synthesis was used. Concatenative means to concat or connect two things together, and synthesis means synthesis. Concatenative synthesis skips over the whole analysis synthesis part of the model, and instead of trying to create voices out of basic source sounds, it creates voices out of voices. Every Vocaloid or Utauloid has at least one corresponding voice bank, which is just a library of high-quality audio files containing recordings of all the fundamental units of speech. The model then takes these units and then strings them together into the desired lyrics. The units used in this concatenation depend on the language and complexity of the voice bank. A phoneme is the smallest unit of speech. Consider any consonant or vowel in any language. English has 26 letters, so naturally it has 44 phonemes. No voice bank uses a single phoneme system though, because why would you do that? The simplest voice bank is the CV or consonant vowel voice bank, which is comprised of diphones and is good for languages comprised of diphones, such as Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. Add a V to your CV and you get VCV, or vowel consonant vowel, which are voice banks comprised of triphones and are good for languages comprised of diphones again. The vowel at the end of a unit can merge with the vowel in front of the next unit to create smoother singing. Instead of Miku, you can have mi and iku to merge together into Miku. For more unpronounceable foreign languages, like English, the standard is a CVVC voice bank, which as you can imagine has many phonemes for the many combinations of sounds you can make in English. On top of these polyphones, a voice bank can also include any other unit of sound that a singer may want to express, such as breathing. Using voice banks like these, you can record the basic units of any language, and there's no longer a need for a model that simulates every single vocal tract configuration. Put it all together and you get beautiful music. But that was just the basis of unit concatenation. It doesn't really encompass what music is. Wait a minute. Since sound is a wave, and waves are just many smaller sinusoidal waves of different frequencies, every single sound placed in the Vocaloid score editor can be split into small pieces and passed through the Fourier transform. Since music is fractions and pitch is fundamental frequency and the Fourier transform is the frequency domain representation, the peaks of all the Fourier transforms of these short pieces, or the peaks of the short-time Fourier transforms, can be shifted in such a way that the original pitch of the recordings are multiplied by a fraction, causing it to become the desired pitch of the song. Since timbre is just the amplitudes of all the higher frequency sinusoids and the envelope describes how the amplitude changes throughout time, the amplitudes of all the peaks in the frequency domain can be adjusted to correspond to the envelope set by the user in the Vocaloid editor to get our desired timbre. Finally, an inverse Fourier transform takes our transformed frequencies and converts it back to pieces of sound that we can connect together into a song that changes in pitch and timbre however we please. In brief, concatenative synthesis with Vocaloid takes every tiny piece of every unit on the lyrics of the score of a song and passes them through a Fourier transform in order to modify the pitch and timbre according to that score. As the tricky part of actually getting the computer to pronounce phonemes is handled in the simplest way possible by pre-recorded audio, the result is a much more natural voice, which makes sense since the voice belongs to a human to begin with. Remember when I said that no one uses source filter models anymore? Well, that was true, except it isn't. The biggest disadvantage of concatenative synthesis is that if the concatenation isn't done very well, then the spaces between the units of sound can seem a bit choppy. This can be solved with either more manipulations in the frequency domain around the boundaries of the units, or with a source filter model such as the EPR model developed by the Vocaloid team to fill in the gaps. Of course, all of this was a bit of a simplification on the inner workings of the Vocaloid singing synthesizer, but it's all a user needed to know to get started, except for maybe the parts about chiptune systems and pipe organs. And ever since its release in 2004, Vocaloid has been present in both mainstream music and more niche circles. Despite its global acclaim, the novelty of Vocaloid has somewhat worn off. Meanwhile, Utau hasn't been updated since 2013. Alas, singing synthesis still has a prevalence on the internet, even if as just a memory for a large amount of the Vocaloid fanbase. New content is still created frequently, and projects like Open Utau aim to create a modern successor to the unmaintained Utau. Meanwhile, in the world of voice synthesis as a whole, new models are being built upon the source filter and concatenation models, using newer technologies such as neural networks. On the topic of technology, there exists an abundance of it, especially recently, with increasing enthusiasm in technology spheres that serves no purpose except perhaps that of malice or profit, and thus must abuse the abstract definition of art to create a justifiable facade of an application. Singing synthesis is an example where this is not the case, but instead a harmony of art and technology that has been researched on throughout the centuries, from the Vox Humana to the vowel organ to the voder to the vocaloid, and consequently has aided and inspired a community of music producers, singers, animators, artists, and developers. Admittedly, we can't expect every piece of technology to be built with the intention of advancing art, science, or society, and perhaps there aren't enough big questions of the centuries for modern technology to tackle, and so we as developers must ask ourselves, what is the purpose of technology?
She